J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining me at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about happiness. I know that's like a strange thing for somebody who makes the case for Christianity or the case for the Christian worldview. That's what I typically do here. Might be a strange topic for that kind of a show, but it turns out that the elusive nature of happiness is directly related to our shrinking Christian worldview in our culture. And so we find that people report higher and higher levels of depression and dissatisfaction with one thing or another. And that's not a coincidence that as that rises, Christianity is declining. There's an inverse relationship because it turns out, I'm going to tell you the key to happiness as reported by a number of different surveys. Now, before I go any further, you might be asking, what's the definition of happiness? Do I mean the kind of thing you feel after you have a In-N-Out burger if you're here in Southern California? No, that's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that kind of more sustained, long-term sense of contentedness, a sense of purpose and direction and fulfillment that gives you an inner sense of satisfaction and joy and happiness, which transcends some meal you might have or some movie you might watch or some vacation you might take. But interestingly, when people talk about this and they take the surveys, regardless of their individual definitions of happiness, there's one condition that comes up again and again and again. If you are engaged in this, you are likely to be more happy. Now, I first started, so today's show, just so you know, is pretty straightforward. It's the secret to happiness that few people talk about. And I think as we go forward in culture, fewer and fewer people will talk about it. As a matter of fact, I've written an article about this on our website at coldcasechristianity.com, which you can take a look over there. It is simply called, Everyone Wants to Be Happy, but Fewer People Are Willing to Do What It Takes. And how it first came to my mind was in reading about an article about a class. Here it is. This is the article which was posted at the New York Times. It was reporting on Yale's most popular class, Psych 157, quote, Psychology and the Good Life. And it's taught by a professor named Laurie Santos, who tries to, I'll just read it to you, who tries to, quote, teach students how to lead a happier, more satisfying life, unquote. Now, it's said in the article that it, quote, focuses both on positive psychology, the characteristics that allow humans to flourish, according to Dr. Santos, and behavioral change, or how to live by those lessons in real life. As a matter of fact, one of the things that is offered here is, I'll just quote her, is they try to develop, quote, good habits like students showing more gratitude, procrastinating less, and increasing social connections. Well, it turns out, that's the quote. But it turns out one of the social connections issues that she raises is the key to happiness. Yeah, it turns out it is about increasing your social connections, if you mean a particular kind of social connection, because that appears to be the key to happiness. And if you're wondering why I think that's the case, about the same time that this article was being reported at the New York Times, another article was being reported. I'll put it on the screen for you here. It is an article that was not from the New York Times. This article was from the Wall Street Journal. And it was a summary of a study in the UK, which found that, guess what? Married people are happier than unmarried people, even when these unmarried people are living together. So living together is not the key. It's marriage that somehow is the key. It was published in the Journal of Happiness Studies. Now, so here's what we're going to talk about today, the key to happiness. And by the way, that study had a very interesting finding. I'll read it to you. It reported, quote, a close marital bond spurs long-term happiness. People who named their spouse, get this, as their best friend were twice as happy as those who didn't, unquote. So, what is the key to happiness? It turns out it's pretty straightforward. Here it is. Marriage. Marriage, over and over again, in a number of different studies, and I could show you these different studies. I've linked to many of them on that website article on our website at coldcasechristianity.com. Here, for example, is one of them It is just that you'll see that, and this is an entire PDF file, it describes how married men are happier than single men, right? They are also reportedly, married men are healthier, they are wealthier, they are more satisfied. You'll see this in a number of, now is this true for women? Yeah, it's actually true in both directions. As a matter of fact, there's almost a chemical issue that seems to be at play here. And I know that sounds like great. When I say something's healthier, you mean to tell me that married couples are healthy? Yeah, they are healthier. And the number of surveys have shown that married couples and people who are married, if they're going through any kind of a health issue, they are far less likely to go through a health issue if they are married than if they're unmarried. As a matter of fact, I've linked to some of these as well on our website, so you can take a look at it. Here's one here, for example. It talks about how in married situations, married couples, they are actually healthier, wealthier, more satisfied. Okay, so that's the first thing. And number two, you'll see that there is a lower level of cortisol. Yeah, that's right. In this article, I'll show you this article. This is a lower level of cortisol that has been measured. It's a stress hormone. And so what it comes down to is because you have less cortisol, if you're a married person, you're less likely to have heart problems, you have an increased immunity, you have less likely to have diabetes, less likely to have cancer. As a matter of fact, there's another article that demonstrates that you are more likely to survive cancer if you are married than if you aren't. Now you might say, well, okay, well, so I don't get it. How does that relate to happiness? Now, I think you can understand there'd at least be a tangential relationship, right? More likely, you're probably happier if you're not ill. You're probably happier if you're not under stress hormone cortisol. You're probably happier if you're not in a financial situation that you would be if you, apparently if you're not married, you're less likely to be wealthy. So there are a number of ways you can see there's a connection between contentedness, a sense of fulfillment, a sense of meeting your purpose, a sense of being satisfied with the life you shape for yourself, if in fact you are married and you're healthy and doing better because of the marriage. Now, let's take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit about a second level benefit of marriage.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
How do we know that the Gospels are reliable?
Well, I looked at them originally as a skeptic. I was only interested in the words of Jesus. I was willing to entertain the possibility that Jesus was a smart guy, but not really that he was God. But as I read through the accounts to get out the red letters of Jesus' wisdom, I was struck by the similarities that I saw in the accounts that I also saw in multiple eyewitness accounts to the same event in my professional work. So for me, it was a matter of assessing the accounts like you would assess other eyewitness accounts about the past. And that's something that I was very familiar with. There's a 4-part template, in fact, that I use to do just that. And it comes from the list of jury recommendations that we offer juries, criminal juries in California, a number of maybe 12 to 14 questions that we allow jurors to consider in their mind when they're assessing eyewitnesses on the stand to see if they're credible or reliable. It all breaks down into 4 large categories. Number 1, was the witness really there when they said they were there? Are they present? Or are they just lying about the fame of the case or whatever it may be? 2, can they be corroborated in some way so we can kind of see if they're verified from another witness or some other piece of evidence? 3, have they changed their story? Are they accurate? Are they telling us the truth? And has it changed, their narrative changed over the years? And finally, it's really about bias. Is there something in the nature of the eyewitness that would cause them to lie for some selfish gain? Those are the 4 areas we look at. So I think if we applied that same kind of a template to the Gospels, we would at least come away with an understanding about whether or not the eyewitness accounts of the Gospels are reliable. Okay, let's talk about a secondary issue that also ties into the issue of happiness, and it comes down to children. It turns out that there are a number of reports going back a couple of generations now that talk about the benefits to children of marriage, intact marriages in which 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting raise their own children. Now, look, that's the ideal. 2 biological parents, low conflict setting, who raise their own kids. Not all of us had the benefit of that kind of upbringing. I was not raised that way. My parents divorced when I was very young. My mom never remarried. It was one biological parent in a low conflict setting. That was better than if it was a high conflict setting, but it was not as good as two biological parents in a low conflict setting. A lot of us right now are living in some form of blended or adopted or merged kind of family units. And we can do a great job in those settings. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, though, is statistically speaking, marriages that involve two biological parents in a low conflict setting benefit kids in a number of ways, and this is reported on a number of different levels depending on survey you're looking at. Let me show you one of these. This survey talks about the benefit of marriage, different kinds of marriage and family units for kids. It's called The Childhood Living Arrangements of Children and the Characteristics of Their Marriages. Here's what it reports in a nutshell. That people who are being raised by two biological parents in a low conflict setting have less behavior problems, drop out of school less often, they're less abused, they take drugs less often, they commit lower number of crimes, they don't become pregnant as teenagers as often. All of these things are benefits that come from family units. Now you might say, well, how does that do with happiness? Well, think about it. If you're engaged in a family unit in which you have less struggles in these areas, you probably are happier. So there's a secondary benefit of marriage that I think weighs into our physical health. Why are we producing less cortisol? Well, because if you are certain kinds of family units are less stressful, produce less cortisol, and then they have other health benefits as a result. It seems reasonable that that's an inference you could make from evidence. I think that it's very reasonable. Let me show you another survey that was posted, which really just talks about the level of poverty that some children will experience if they're in something other than a two biological parent low conflict setting. So you also have good evidence to suggest that people suffer less poverty. Young people suffer poverty less growing up, for example, in family units that are two biological parents in a low conflict setting. I'll give you one last study. Now, there's a ton of these that are out there, but I'll just give you one last one here. And this one talks about health of young people, and it is infant mortality statistics. This is from PubMed.gov. So you can look and see that even health of youngsters, very young among us, is dictated by the kind of family unit you're in. Marriage, committed long-term marriages with loving parents, low conflict setting, has a benefit not just for your personal happiness, which we've already demonstrated or documented, but there's also a benefit for your kids, which makes sense that would also feed back into your level of happiness. So there's a sense in which this benefits more than just you or your spouse. It benefits your kids, which also benefit you and your spouse. Okay, so that sounds good. Now, this is why I often, when I'm working with young people, high schoolers, at, say, Summit Worldview Conference, we have a chance to go out on the porch at the end of the day and answer questions for students. And I will tell you, I am quick to answer those questions, but I want to get to one more important issue, which I save. Before I leave them, I ask them about what I call trajectory decisions. Now, I've talked about this a little bit before. You may have heard me say it. I've certainly written about it on our website. But trajectory decisions are simply those early decisions we make that have a lifelong impact because we made them early. So it's kind of like if you're on Earth and you're trying to travel to the moon, if you make a decision that's wrong, you've left the planet Earth and now you're about a mile away from the moon, you make a 2-degree error, you're still going to land on the surface of the moon. You're almost there anyway. A 2-degree error will not inhibit your landing on the moon. On the other hand, if you're just leaving Earth and you make a 2-degree decision over here that's wrong, you can miss the moon by many thousands of miles. The earlier the decision, sometimes the more important that decision is. I call those trajectory decisions. They will change the course of your life. And when I ask young people, what is the trajectory decision you think you're going to make in the next 5 years that's going to be the most important? A few will say, which I think is the most important trajectory decision, they will say worldview. And that is the most important trajectory decision, because even how you feel about marriage and what the sense of marriage is, the commitment to marriage, even if you have a certain sense of that's important, well, your worldview is going to dictate how important that is. We're living in a worldview right now surrounding us in culture that has a very low priority for long-term committed marriages. But the Christian worldview places a high priority on that. So worldview is going to be the biggest thing you can decide in that trajectory decision. What is true? What is the lens through which I can observe the world and make sense of the world? But the second decision, most youngsters, most high schoolers are going to say, and this is what they're telling me anyway, is that it's job. It's training for that job. It's like, what school should I go to? I have to make a decision what college I'm going to go to in the next couple of years. I got to make a decision about what career I want to pursue, so I know what I'm educating myself for. Those are good, important trajectory decisions. But marriage is even more important. Who will your spouse be? Because what's happening here is that you have an opportunity early on to make a lifelong decision with spouse that will change the trajectory of everything else. I've known people who made very good choices about spouse, and even though they made okay, not so great choices about career or education, they had great lives. I've also known people who have made great choices about career and education, but bad choices about a spouse, and just train wrecked everything. So I think and the reason why I bring it up to young people is that you've got a strategy that's going to help you pick the best school. You're already thinking about your strategy for how you're going to apply. How are you going to find that school? How are you going to make decisions about your career? You're thinking very strategically about those things. Most of us, though, at that age are not thinking strategically about spouse. We just hope that we'll dumb into one. We'll just bounce into one as we're going and chasing all the other stuff. That we'll find somebody out there who likes us. The reality of it is we need to be as intentional about spouse as we are about other things. That's all I'm trying to say. Those are important trajectory decisions, because it turns out that happiness is tied much more to your married life than anything else. So you want to be able to address that as a high priority trajectory decision. Take one last break. I'm going to show you the challenge we now face, though, and answer some of the criticism that we sometimes get as Christians, because we seem to divorce as much as anybody else. Let's talk about that after the break.
Be sure to visit the Cold-Case Christianity website daily to read Jim's blog, watch the weekly video, or listen to the Cold-Case Christianity Podcast. You'll also find great free resources, including the free downloadable monthly Bible insert. While you're there, be sure to sign up for Jim's daily case notes email. Cold Case Christianity is designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, now in this segment I want to talk about why marriage is waning and provide you some good, that's bad news, but I also want to provide you some good news. Now, I think you've heard a number of times people will say, well, look, you Christians divorce as much as... I was just reading this morning about a very high profile couple, Christian couple, that are planning to get divorced. And of course, they announce it on Instagram or on Twitter. This is kind of typically how this goes now. And you think to yourself, well, gosh, I read statistics. It seems like the divorce rate for Christians is about as high as the divorce rate for non-Christians. Well, that's true if you don't define clearly what you mean by Christians. People will identify as Christians, yet really don't know a thing about Christianity, read their Bible like never. They go to church on holidays, and they don't know much about what the Bible even teaches about the principles of marriage. But they will identify as Christians. Yes, if that's what you're talking about, those folks will divorce at the same rate as pretty much anybody else who doesn't know anything about what the Bible says about marriage. On the other hand, if you've got Bible reading, committed, church attending, church community belonging Christians, when those are polled and you separate all the people who are Christian in name only, you will find that the Christians divorce at a much lower rate than the general population. But you've got to define what we mean by Christian. Do we even believe that these teachings about marriage are true from the Christian scriptures? All right, that all being said, it is true that as we see that Christianity is declining in America, so is the rate of people who are willing to make lifelong commitments to God, called marriage. It's a covenant with your spouse, you and your spouse making a covenant to God about a forever relationship. That's very different. You don't see that happening as much anymore. And we have lots of studies going back probably 10 years or more. I'll just put a couple on the screen for you here. This one, for example, talks about, this is from the Washington Post, talks about how millennials are less interested than the generation before them, Gen X, which were less interested than boomers, and on and on. And so you see that millennials are far less likely than Gen X or boomers to marry. And if they do marry, it's usually much later in life. There's another article here. I'll put it up on the screen for you. It did talk about something similar, and that talks about how men particularly don't want to marry, and this is what's called this is from the Paired Life. This is called a modern problem: men not wanting to marry. as a matter of fact, the number of people who are just cohabitating, that is not living together, that is really increasing, right? You know this already. As a matter of fact, I was just reading somewhere that the average rate of having your first child is now lower, the average age of people who are having their first child, what age are they when they have that first child, is now lower than the age at which they marry, which means that most of these kids are being born out of wedlock. And that's why it's important for us to look at surveys like the one here at Barna that talk about marriage and divorce statistics. And I want to encourage you to dig down deep into these kinds of studies, because you will find, as I did, that we might say that people who identify as Christians, they are not necessarily going to be divorcing at a lower rate. But there's the key, right? The key is they're only identifying as Christians. They aren't people who are really committed or know what Christianity even teaches. So I want to leave you with some good news if you are a Christ follower and if you are somebody who is committed to your Christian worldview and what it teaches about this covenantal relationship, this covenant relationship that you have with your wife, we call marriage, that is done before God. It's a relationship that is very different than the kind of, I was reading someplace that, it was in Bloomberg, where they were saying, hey, if you're considering marriage, now is the time for a prenup. Really? So that basically assumes that that marriage is not a forever relationship, because you need a prenuptial agreement to secure the backside. Well, there is no backside for Susie and I. There is no end to this. It's death, till death do us part. So there's no sense of our prenuptial agreement is called a will and testament. Okay, it's basically the trust that we have because we're going to die together. So that is a different kind of way of seeing this relationship. Now, interestingly, it's not just marriages that do well. Of course they do. If you are married, you are far likely to report happiness in your life than if you're not married. But it turns out that Christian marriages are even more likely to say they are happy. I'll show you some of that work. Here, for example, is an article. Let's see, this article is from The Exchange. It's Ed Stetzer, a friend of ours, who has written about this. He used to be with Breakpoint. Marriage, divorce, and the church. What did the stats say? And can marriage be happy? Well, this is another good article that dives into the difference between people who say they are Christian and people who are actually doing the things that Christians who are committed would do, giving them some evidence that they actually are Christians. So I would commend this article to you. It's at Christianity Today. And there's another article here which talks about the relationship for just Christian couples. Here it is. It's from the Christian Post. Married couples who attend church services together are less likely to divorce, according to a study. So this kind of piggybacks off the idea that Ed's talking about in his report, where he's talking about how people who are committed as Christians are less likely to divorce. This study actually confirms that. And what's even more interesting, it seems to me, is that people who report that they go to church together, that they are chasing God together, they are happier. So Christian marriages are even happier than non-Christian marriages, which are happier than people who aren't married. So there's like tiers to this. And I'll show you this article. It's also from the Christian Post. Christians happiest amongst all groups, including all faith groups. And what it kind of says here is that if the couples who identified themselves as very happy, they will agree with the statement that God is at the center of our marriage, quote unquote. And if you attend church together, you are even more likely to be happy. As a matter of fact, that last article in the Christian Post talked about let's go back to, I'll show it to you again. This one, the one that is about married couples who attend church service are less likely to divorce. That article also describes the fact that you are less likely, again, talks about health levels are higher, less depression, a number of other factors that you might relate to happiness are more likely to be generated in marriages in which people share the same worldview, and it's a Christian worldview that drives them to even attend church regularly together. So it turns out that there's a connection between. Now, why would that be the case? Is it just because we're in a culture that still has a memory of Christianity? Well, no, I don't think so. I think what it really comes down to is that Christianity describes the world the way it really is, including humans the way they really are, and human relationships and the way they really are. There is a sense in which we have been designed by our Maker for each other. And when we find ourselves in that kind of marriage, and we are acting out the roles as described by God in Christian scripture, those folks are happier. The key to happiness simply is a robust Christian worldview that leads us to the kinds of relationships we would have under a Christian worldview. Now, one last thing. You may be saying to yourself, yeah, but I'm not married, and it doesn't seem fair to me. You're talking as though, what about people who are single, and they stay single their entire lives? What about those folks? So as I see it, marriage is a gift. It's a gift from God. And you'll see this in all through the Proverbs. If you read the Proverbs, you'll see that all the time it's from the Lord. This marriage, this happy spouse, this spouse that's not quarrelsome. These are gifts from God. I think marriage is a gift from God. And you ought to seek gifts from God. But not everyone gets the same gift. So let's say, for example, you said, I think I have the gift of music. I feel like I could, I like music. And I wonder if I'm gifted that way. I've never really pursued it, and I don't know what God's gifts are to me. Let me try. And so you get out there and you try for a while, and you look like one of those bad candidates on American Idol who can't sing, and everyone is mocking. And you realize at some point, man, I don't think God's given me this gift of music. Okay. I'm glad you sought it. I'm glad you seek the kinds of gifts you think are from God, but you don't know until you seek it. But you may find along the way that you don't have the gift of music, and you may not also be gifted a spouse. But that's okay, because that's just, everyone gets a different kind of gift, different kind of gifting that allows them to share the gospel with the world around them. And what's sad is sometimes we get this gift of marriage and we don't see it as similar to the gift of music. Because if I had the gift of music, I might say, well, God has given me this gift to sing about Him to a world that has ears. Well, maybe God has given you the gift of marriage to proclaim to the world around you the gospel through your marriage. Sometimes I think because we don't see it as this gift, we just kind of think, oh, we got lucky. That single person just doesn't have that. Well, no, actually, these are gifts that have been given to us for a purpose. So you may be single, but don't feel bad about that. God is going to gift you with some other things, some other ways, some other talent that you can use to share the gospel. But if you are married, remember this marriage is also a gift that God has given you to proclaim the gospel, if nothing else, to your own kids. Let's take advantage of that. That will, in the end, make you happy. Hope this helps you, and we'll talk more about happiness and the Christian worldview and how it relates to culture this season, Season 7 of Cold-Case Christianity. I'll see you right here next week.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.